10 orders. We are loved once. We were loved once. Why have you forsaken us, Almighty, shadow of my soul? Where have you gone? Collected on the second day of Kakash, year of 1171, 5 seconds before death. Subject was a light-eyed woman in her third decade. 8 months later, Kaladin's stomach growled as he reached through the bar and accepted the bowl of slop. He pulled the small bowl, more a cup, between the bars, sniffed it, then grimaced as the caged wagon began to roll again. The sludgy grey slop was made from overcooked tallow grain, and this batch was flagged with crusted bits of yesterday's meal. Revolting though it was all he would get. He began to eat, legs hanging out between the bars, watching the scenery pass. The other slaves in the cage clutched their bowl protectively, afraid that someone might steal from them. One of them tried to steal Kaladin's food on the first day. It nearly broken the man's arm. Now everyone left him alone. Treated him just fine. He ate with his fingers, careless of the dirt. He'd stopped eating dirt months ago. He hated that he felt some of that same paranoia that the others showed. How could he not, after 8 months of beating, deprivation and brutality? He fought down the paranoia. He wouldn't become like them. Even if he had given up everything else, even if all had been taken from him, even if there was no longer hope of escape, the one thing would retain. He was a slave, but he didn't need to think like one. He finished his slop quickly. Nearby, one of the other slaves began to cough weakly. There were 10 slaves in the wagon, all men, scraggly bearded, and dirty. Soon of the 3 wagons in the caravan through the unclaimed hills. The sun blazed reddish-white on the horizon like the hottest part of the smith's fire. It lit the flaming clouds with a spray of color, paint thrown carelessly on the cavern. Covered in tall, monotonously green grass, the hill seemed endless. On the nearby mound, a small figure flitted around the plants, dancing like a fluttering insect. The figure was amorphous, vaguely translucent. Windspring were devious spirits, who had a penchant for staying where they weren't wanted. He'd hoped this one had gotten bored and left, but as Kaladin tried to toss his wooden pole aside, he found that it stuck to his fingers. The windspring laughed, zipping by, nothing more than a ribbon of light without form. He cursed, tugging on the bowl. Windspring often played pranks like that. He prodded at the bowl, and eventually came free. Grumbling, he tossed it to one of the other slaves. The man quickly began to lick at the remnants of the slop. "Hey," a voice whispered. Kaladin stood to the side. A slave with dark skin, matted hair was crawling up to him, timid, as if expecting Kaladin to be angry. "You're not like the others." The slave's black eyes glanced upward, toward Kaladin's forehead, which bore 3 brands. The first 2 made a glyph, given to him 8 months ago, on his last day in the Amaran army. The third was fresh, given to him by his most recent master, Shash. The last glyph read, "Dangerous." The slave had his hand hidden behind his rags. A knife? No, that was ridiculous. None of these slaves could have hidden a weapon. The loose hidden in Kaladin's belt were as close as one could get. But old instincts could not be banished easily. So Kaladin watched the hand. "I heard the guards talking," the slave continued, shuffling a little closer. He had a twitch that made him blink too frequently. You tried to escape before, they said. You have escaped before. Kaladin made no reply. Look, the slave said, moving his hand out from behind his rags and revealing his ball of slop. It was half full. Take me with you next time, he whispered. I'll give you this. Half my food from now on, until we get away. Please. As he spoke, he attracted a few hunger springs. They looked like brown flies that flitted around the man's head, almost too small to see. Kaladin turned away, looking out at the endless hills and the shifting, moving grasses. He stood, rested one arm across the bar, and placed his head against it, legs still hanging out. Well, the slave asked, you're an idiot. If you gave me half your food, it'd be too quick to escape for you to flee, which I won't. It doesn't work. But 10 times, Kaladin whispered. 10 escape attempts in 8 months. Fleeing from five different masters. And how many of them worked? Well, I mean, you are still here. 8 months. 8 months as a slave. 8 months of slop and beatings. It might as well have been an eternity. He barely remembered the army anymore. You can't hide as a slave, Kaladin said. Not with that brand on your forehead. Oh, I got away a few times, but they always found me, and then back I went. Once, men had called them lucky, some blessed. Those had been lies. If anything, Kaladin had bad luck. Soldiers were superstitious sorts, and though he initially resisted the way of thinking, it was going harder and harder. Every person I'd ever tried to protect had ended up dead, time and time again. Now, here he was, in an even worse situation than when he began. It was better not to resist. This was his lot, and he was resigned to it. There was a certain power in that, and freedom. The freedom of not having to care. The slave eventually realized Kaladin wasn't going to see anything further, so he retreated, eating his slop. The guns continued to roll, fields of green extending in all directions. The area around the rattling wagons was bare. However, when they approached, the grass pulled away. Each individual stalk withdrawing into a pinprick hole in the stone. After the wagons moved on, the grass seemingly poked back out and stretched the blaze back toward the air. And so the cages moved along what appeared to be an open rock highway cleared just for them. This far into the unclaimed hills, the high storms were incredibly powerful. The plant had learned to survive. That's what you had to do. Learn to survive. Brace yourself, weather the storm. Kaladin caught a whiff of another sweaty, unwashed body and heard the sound of shuffling feet. He looked suspiciously to the side, expecting that same slave to be back. It was a different man this time. Though he had a long black beard stuck with bits of food and snarled with dirt, Kaladin kept his own beard shorter, allowing Tavlak's mercenaries to hack it down periodically. Like Kaladin, the slave wore the remains of a brown sack tied with a rag, and he was dark-eyed. Of course, perhaps a deep dark green. Though with dark eyes, it was hard to tell. They all looked brown or black unless you caught them in the right light. If there's a problem with the stream, I seem to have like drop frames. The newcomer cringed away, raising his hands. He had a rash on one hand, the skin just faintly discolored. He liked the approach because he had seen Kaladin respond to the other man. The slaves had been frightened of him since the first day, but were also obviously curious. Kaladin sighed and turned away. The slave assistantly sat down. Whenever I ask how you became a slave, friend, I can't help but wonder. We're all wondering. Judging by his accent and the dark hair, the man was Alethi, like Kaladin. Most of the slaves were. Kaladin didn't reply to the question. Me? I actually heard of Kull, the man said. He had a raspy voice, like sheets of paper rubbing together. If I had taken one shawl, they must have just beaten me. But a whole herd? 17 head? He chuckled to himself, admiring his own audacity. In far corner of the wagon, someone called. Again. They were sorry lots, even for slaves. Weak, sickly, underfed. Some, like Kaladin, were repeat runaways. Though Kaladin was the only one with a Shash brand, with the most worthless of a worthless caste, purchased at a steep discount. They were probably being taken for resale in a remote place where men were desperate for labor. There were plenty of small, independent cities along the coast of Unclaimed Hill, places where foreign rules governing the use of slaves were just a distance from more. Coming this way was dangerous. These lands were ruled by nobody, and by cutting across open land and staying away from established trade routes. Vlak, I cannot pronounce her name. Vlak, Tvlakv, Valak, could easily run afoul of unemployed mercenaries, men who had no honor and no fear of slaughtering a slave master and his slaves in order to steal a few chawls and wagons. Men who had no honor. Were there men who had honor? No, Kaladin thought. Honor died 18 months ago. So, asked the scraggly bearded man, what did you do to get made a slave? Kaladin raised his arm against the bars again. How did you get caught? Odd thing that, the man said. Kaladin hadn't answered his question, but he had replied. That seemed enough. It was a woman, of course. She'd have known she'd sell me. Shouldn't have stolen Charles. Too slow. Horses would have been better. The man laughed riotously. Horses? What do you think me, a madman? If I've been caught stealing those, I've been hanged. Charles at least only earned me a slave's brand. Kaladin glanced to the side. The man's forehead brand was older than Kaladin's. The skin around the scar faded to white. What was that glyph here? Sas Muram, Kaladin said. It was the High Lord district where the man had originally been branded. The man looked up with shock. Hey, you know glyphs? Several of the slaves nearby stared at this oddity. It must have been a better story. You must have an even better story than I thought, friend. Kaladin stared over those grasses blowing in the wind. Kaladin stared out over those grasses blowing in the mild breeze. Whenever the wind picked up, the more sensitive of the grass stalks shrank down into their burrows, leaving the landscape patchy, like the coat of a sickly horse. That windspring was still there, moving between patches of grass. How long had it been following him? At least a couple of months now. That was downright odd. Maybe it wasn't the same one. They were impossible to tell apart. Well, the man prodded. Why are you here? There are many reasons I'm here, Kaladin said. Failures, crimes, betrayals. Probably the same for most every one of us. Around him, several of the men grunted in agreement. One of those grunts then degenerated into a hacking cough. Persistent coughing, a part of Kaladin's mind, thought, accompanied by an excess of phlegm and fevered mumbling at night. Sounds like the grindlings. Well, the talkative man said, perhaps I should ask a different question. Be more specific. That's what my mother always said. Say what you mean, and ask what you want. What is the story of you getting that first brand of yours? Kaladin sat, feeling the wagon thump and roll beneath him. I killed the light eyes. His unnamed companion whistled again, this time even more appreciative than before. I'm surprised they let you leave. Killing the light eyes isn't why I was made a slave, Kaladin said. It's the one I didn't kill that's the problem. How's that? Kaladin shook his head, then stopped answering the talkative man's question. The man eventually wandered to the front of the wagon's cage and sat down, staring at his bare feet. Hours later, Kaladin still sat in his place, idly fingering the glyphs on his forehead. This was his life, day in and day out, riding in these cursed wagons. His first brands had healed long ago, but the skin around the sash brand was red, irritated, and crusted with scabs. It throbbed, almost like a second heart. It was even worse than the burn had when he grabbed the heated bun. It was even worse than the burn he had when he grabbed the handle of a pot as a child. A sense drilled into Kaladin by his father whispered in the back of his brain, give him the proper way to care for a burn, apply salve to prevent infection, wash once daily. Those memories weren't a comfort, they were an annoyance. He didn't have a 4-leaf sap or Lister's oil. He didn't even have water for the washing. The part of the wound that had scabbed over pulled at his skin, making his forehead feel tight. He could barely pass a few minutes without scrunching up his brow and irritating the wound. He grew accustomed to reaching up and wiping away the streaks of blood that trickled from the cracks. His right forearm was smeared with it. If he had a mirror, he could probably have put a tiny red rot spring gathering around the wound. The sun set in the west, but the welcome kept rolling. A violet Salas peeked over the horizon to the east, seeming hesitant at first, as if making sure the sun had vanished. It was a clear night, and the stars shivered. High above, Town Scar, a spot of deep red stars that stood out vibrantly from twinkling white ones, was high in the sky this season. That slave who had been coughing earlier was at it again, a ragged, wet cough. Once Kaladin would have been quick to go help, but something within him had changed. So many people who tried to help were now dead, and it seemed to him, irrationally, that the man would be better off without its interference. After falling, Time, then Dalet and his team, then 10 successive groups of slaves, it was hard to find the will to try again. Two hours past first moon. Two hours past first moon. Valak finally called a halt. Two British mercenaries climbed from their places atop their wagons. They moved to build a small fire. Lanky Taran, the 7th boy, tended the Charles, the large crustacean. Wow. A low life before death radiant. I don't know what that is. But thank you for the comments, much appreciated. The large crustaceans were nearly as big as their wagons themselves. They settled down, pulling into their shells for the night with a cloth full of grains. Soon, there were nothing more than 3 lumps in the darkness, barely distinguishable from boulders. Finally, Valak began checking on the slaves one at a time, giving each a ladle of water, making certain his investments were healthy, or at least as healthy as he could be expected for their poor lot. Valak started with the first wagon, and Kaladin, still sitting, put his fingers into his makeshift belt, checking on the leaves he'd hidden there. They crackled satisfactorily. The stiff dried husk rough against his skin. He still wasn't certain what he was going to do with them. He grabbed them on a whim, during one of the sessions where he'd been allowed out of the wagon to stretch his legs. He doubted anyone else on the caravan knew how to recognize black bane, narrow leaves on a trefoil prong, so that had been too much of a risk. Absently, he took the leaves out and rubbed them between the forefingers and palm. They had to dry before reaching their potency. Why did they carry them? Did they mean to give them to Valak and get revenge? Or were they a contingency to return in case things got so bad, too unbearable? Surely I haven't fallen that far, I thought. Just more likely it's the instinct where it was just more likely it's the instinct of securing a weapon on someone, no matter how unusual. The landscape was dark. Salas was the smallest and dimmest of the moons, and while her violet coloring had inspired countless poets, she didn't do much to help. You see your hand in front of your face. "Oh," a soft feminine voice said. "What's that?" The translucent figure, just a handspan tall, picked up from over the edge of the floor near Kaladin. She climbed up into the wagon, as if scaling some high plateau. The windscreen had taken the shape of a young woman. A larger spring could change shapes and sizes. With an angular face and long flowing hair that faded into mist behind her head, she, Kaladin couldn't help but think of the whispering as a she, was formed of pale blue eyes and wore a simple flowing white dress of a girlish cut that came down to mid-calf. Like the hair, it faded to mist at the very bottom. Her feet, hands, and face were crisply distinct, and she had the hips and bust of a slender woman. Kaladin frowned at the spirits. Spring were all around. You just ignored them most of the time. But this one was an oddity. The windscreen walked upward, as if climbing an invisible staircase. She reached a height where she could stare at Kaladin's hand, so he closed his fingers around the black leaves. She walked around his face in a circle. Although she glowed like an after-image from looking at the sun, her form provided no real illumination. She bent down, looking at his hand from different angles, like a child expecting to find a piece of candy. "What is it?" Her voice was like a whisper. "You can show me. I won't tell anyone. This is a treasure. Have you cut off a piece of the knight's cloak and tucked it away? Is it the heart of a beetle, so tiny yet powerful?" He said nothing, causing the spring to pout. She floated up, hovering though she had no wings, and looked him in the eyes. "Kaladin, why must you ignore me?" Kaladin started. "What did you say?" She smiled mischievously and sprang away, her figure blurring into a long white ribbon of white-blue light. She shot between the bars, twisting and warping the air like a strip of cloth caught in the wind, and darted beneath the wagon. "Storm you," Kaladin said, leaping to his feet. "Spirit, what did you say? Repeat that." Spring didn't use people's names. Spring weren't intelligent. The larger ones like Windspring or River Spring could mimic voices and expression, but didn't actually think. They didn't. "Did any of you hear that?" Kaladin asked, turning to the cage's other occupant. The roof was just high enough to let Kaladin stand. The others were lying back, to get a ladle of water. The gun response beyond a few monsters to be quiet, some coughs from the sick man in the corner. Even Kaladin's quote-unquote friend from earlier ignored him. The man had fallen into a stupor, staring at his feet, wiggling his toes periodically. Maybe they hadn't seen the spring. Many of the larger ones were invisible except to the person they were tormenting. Kaladin sat back down to the floor of the wagon, hanging his legs outside. The Windspring had said his name, but undoubtedly she just repeated she'd heard before. But none of the men in the cage knew his name. Maybe I'm going mad, Kaladin thought, seeing things that aren't there, hearing voices. He took a deep breath, then opened his hand. His grip was cracked and broken. His grip had cracked and broken the leaves. He'd need to tuck them away to prevent further. "Those leaves look interesting," said that same feminine voice. "You like them a lot, don't you?" Kaladin jumped, twisting to the side. The Windspring stood in air just beside his head, white dress rippling in the wind. Kaladin couldn't feel. "How do you know my name?" he demanded. The Windspring didn't answer. She walked in air over to the bars, then poked her head out, watching Valak, the slaver, administer drinks to the last few slaves in the first wagon. She looked back at Kaladin. "Why don't you fight? You did before. Now you've stopped. Why do you care, Spirit?" She cocked her head. "I don't know," she said. as if surprised at herself. But I do. Isn't that odd? It's more than odd. What did he make of a spring that only used his name, but seemed to remember things he had done weeks ago? People don't eat leaves, you know, Kaladin, she said, folding translated arms. Then she cocked her head. Or do you? I can't remember. You're so strange. Stuffing something into your mouth, looking at other things, when you don't think anyone's looking. How do you know my name? He whispered. How do you know it? I know it because it's mine. My parent told it to me. I don't know. Well, I don't either, she said, not as if she'd just won some grand argument. Fine, he said, but why are you using my name? Because it's polite, and you are impolite? Spring don't know what that means. See? There, she said, pointing at him. See? There, she said, pointing at him. Impolite. Kaladin blinked. Well, his farm was far from where he'd grown up. Walking foreign stone and eating foreign food. Perhaps the Spring who lived where were different from those back home. So why don't you fight? She asked, sitting down to rest on his legs, looking up at his face. She had no weight that he could feel. I can't fight, he said softly. You did before? He closed his eyes and rested his head forward against the bar. I'm so tired. It didn't mean the physical fatigue. The 8 months eating leftovers had stolen much of the lean strength he'd cultivated while at war. He felt tired. Even when he got enough sleep, even on the rare days when he wasn't hungry, cold or stiff from a beating. So tired. Been tired before. I have failed, Spirit, he replied, squeezing his eyes shut. Would you torment me so? They were all dead. Sun and Dalet, and before that Talk, and before that Talks and Takers, before that Tien, before that blood on his hands and the corpse of a young girl with pale skin. Some of the slaves nearby muttered, likely thinking he was mad. Anyone could end up drawing its spring, but you learned earlier that talking to one was pointless. Was he mad? Perhaps I should wish for that. Madness was an escape from pain. Instead, it terrified him. He opened his eyes. Balak was finally waddling up to Kaladin's wagon with his bucket of water. The portly brown-eyed man walked there very faintly, the result of a broken leg, perhaps. He was tailing, and our tailing men had the same stark white beards, regardless of their age or the color of their hair on their head, and white eyebrows. Those eyebrows grew very long, and the tailing wore them pushed back over the ears. It's a lot of eyebrows. That made him appear to have 2 white streaks in his otherwise black hair. His clothing, stripped trousers of black and red, with dark blue sweater that matched the color of his neat cap, had once been fine. But it was now growing ragged. Had it once been something other than a slaver? This life, the casual buying and selling of human flesh, seemed to have an effect on men. He's worried so. And even if it did fill one's money pouch. Balak kept his distance from Kaladin, carrying his oil lantern over to inspect the coffin slave at the front of the cage. Balak called to his mercenaries. Blut. Kaladin didn't know why it bothered to learn their names. Wondered over. Balak spoke quietly, pointing at the slave. Blut nodded. Slab-like face shadowed in the lantern light, and pulled the cudgel free from his belt. Windspring took the form of white ribbon. The windspring took the form of a white ribbon, then zipped over toward the sick man. She spun and twisted a few times before landing on the floor, becoming a girl again. She leaned in to inspect the man, like a curious child. Kaladin turned away and closed his eyes, but he could still hear the coffin. Inside his mind, his father's voice responded. To cure the grinding coughs, said a carefully precise tone, I mixed 2 handfuls of blood ivy crushed the powder each day. If you don't have that, deciding to give the patient plenty of liquids, preferably with sugar stirred in. As long as the patient stays hydrated, he will most likely survive. The disease sounds far worse than it is. Most likely survive. The scoffs continued. Someone unlatched the cage door. Would they know how to help the man? Such an easy solution. Give him water and he would leave. It didn't matter. Best not to get involved. Men dying on the battlefield. A youthful face. So familiar and dear. Looking to Kaladin for salvation. The sword won't slide open the side of her neck. A shadowbearer charged him through Amaron's rank. Blood, death, failure, pain. And his father's voice. Can you really leave him? Son? Let him die when you could have helped? Storm it. Stop, Kaladin yelled, standing. The other slaves scrambled back. Blut jumped up, slammed the cage door closed and holding up his cudgel. Black shied behind the mercenary, using him as cover. Kaladin took a deep breath, closing his hand around the leaves and then raising the other to his head, whipping away a smell of blood. Across the small cage, bare feet tapping on the wood. Blood glared at Kaladin. Blood glared as Kaladin knelt beside the sick man. The flickering light illuminated a long, drawn face and nearly bloodless lips. The man coughed up phlegm. It was greenish and solid. Kaladin felt the man's neck was swelling and then checked his dark brown eyes. His skull with a grinding cough, Kaladin said. He will leave if you give him an extra ladle of water every 2 hours for 5 days or so. You'll have to force it down his throat. Mix in sugar if you have any. Blood scratched at his ample chin, then glanced at the shorter slave. Pull him out, Black said. The wounded slave awoke as Blood unlocked the cage. The mercenary waved Kaladin back with his cudgel, and Kaladin reluctantly withdrew. After putting away his cudgel, Blood grabbed the slave under his arm and dragged him out. Welcome to the stream. For the people who just joined, I'm reading The Way of Kings in the Stormlight series. I'm in chapter 2. It's pretty interesting so far. After putting away his cudgel, Blood grabbed the slave under his arm and dragged him out, all the while trying to keep a nervous eye on Kaladin. Kaladin's last failed escape attempt had involved 20 armed slaves. His master should have executed him for that, but he had claimed Kaladin was intriguing and branded him with a sash, then sold him for a pittance. That's not actually funny about this. There always seemed to be a reason Kaladin survived when those he tried to help died. Some men might have seen it as a blessing, but he saw it as an ironic kind of torment. He spent some time under his previous master, spoken a slave from the West, a Saleh man who had spoken of the old magic from their legends, its ability to curse people. Could that be what was happening to Kaladin? Don't be foolish, he told himself. The cage door snapped back in place, locking. The kicks were necessary. Balak had to protect his... My mouth is getting dry. Valak had to protect his fragile investment from the high storms. The cages had wooden sides that could be pulled up and locked into place during the furious gale. Blood dragged the slave watered fire. Beside unpacked water barrel, Kaladin felt himself relax. There, he told himself, perhaps he can still help. Perhaps there's a reason to care. But Kaladin opened his hand and looked down at the crumpled black lace in his palm. He didn't need these. Sticking them to Valak's drink would not only be difficult but pointless. Did he really want the slaver dead? What would that accomplish? A low crack rang in the air, followed by a second one. Dollar, like someone dropping a bag of grain. Kaladin snapped his head up, looking to where Blut had episode the sixth slave. The mercenary raised his cudgel one more time, then snapped it down, the weapon making a cracking sound as it hit the slave's skull. The slave hadn't uttered a cry of pain or protest. His corpse slumped over in the darkness. Blut casually picked it up and slung it over his shoulder. No, Kaladin yelled, looking across the cage and slammed his hands against the bars. Balak stood, warming himself by the fire. Fuck you, Kaladin screamed. You could have lived, you bastard. Balak glanced at him. Then leisurely, the slave had walked over, straightening his deep look in his cap. It would have gotten your sake, you see. His voice lightly accented, bashing words together, and not giving the proper syllable emphasis. Telling always sounded to Kaladin like we're mumbling. I would not lose an entire wagon for one man. He's past the spreading stage, Kaladin said, slamming his hands against the bars again. If any of us were going to catch it, we'd have done so by now. Hope that you didn't. I think it was past saving, and I told you otherwise. I should be. And I should believe you? Deserter? Vlak said, amused. A man with eyes that smoldered hate? You would kill me. He shrugged. I cannot, so long as you are strong when it's time for sales. You should bless me for saving you from that man's sickness. I'll bless your cane when I pile it off myself, Kaladin replied. Valak smiled, walking back toward the fire. Keep that fuel, deserter, and that strength. It will pay me well on our arrival. Not if you don't live that long, Kaladin thought. Kaladin always warmed the last of the water from the bucket used for the slaves. He'd make himself tea from it, hanging it over the fire. If Kaladin made sure it was watered last, then powdered the leaves and dropped them into. Kaladin froze, then looked down at his hands. In his haste, he'd forgotten that he had been holding the black vein. He dropped the flakes as he slammed his hand against the bars. Only a few beads stuck to his palms, not enough to be potent. He spun to look backwards. The floor of the cage was dirty and covered with grime. If the flakes had fallen there, there was no way to collect them. The wind gathered suddenly, blowing dust, crumbs and dirt out of the wagon and into the night. Even in this, Kaladin failed. He sank down, his back to the bars, and bowed his head, defeated. That cursed Winspan kept darting around him, looking confused. Alright, I'm done with chapter 2. And that was a slug and a half. That was reading is not as easy as it seems, especially reading out loud. People tell you, oh, it's not like speaking. Your mouth gets dry, you get tongue tied. It's exhausting. But this was fun. It was a great chapter. You get to know more about Kaladin and his thought process. Anyways, thank you for listening. For people, no one actually stayed to the end. If people just joined, or if you're returning, I'm not sure if I should keep streaming or take a break and start again. I need to get some water first of all. I'll be back in like 2 minutes. You guys can be here till then. Alright. Chapter 3 City of Bells. A man. What? Testing 1, 2, 3. Alright. Chapter 3 City of Bells. A man stood on his cliffside and watched his homeland fall into dust. A man stood on the cliffside and watched his homeland fall into dust. The water surged beneath, so far beneath, and heard a child crying. They were his own tears. Collected on Cabron, City of Bells, was not a place that Shallan had ever imagined he would visit. Though she'd often dreamed of traveling, she'd expected to spend her early lives sequestered in her family's manor, only escaping through the books of her father's library. She'd expected to marry one of her father's allies, then spend the rest of her life sequestered in his manor. But expectations were like fine pottery. The harder you held them, the more likely they were to crack. She found herself breathless, clutching a leather-bound drawing pad to her chest, as longshoremen pulled the ship into the dock. Cabron was enormous, built up the side of a steep incline. The city was wedged-shaped, as if it were built into a wide crack. On the open side toward the ocean, the buildings were blocky, with square windows, and appeared to have been constructed of some kind of mud or daub. Creme perhaps. They were painted bright colors, reds and orange most often, but occasionally blues and yellows too. She could hear the bells already. She could hear the bells already, tinkling in the wind, ringing with pure voices. She had to strain her neck to look up toward the city's loftiest rim. Cabron was like a mountain towering over her, How many people lived in a place like this? Thousands, tens of thousands? She for the game, daunted yet excited, then blinked pointedly, fixing the image of the city in her memory. Sailors rushed about. The Wind's Pleasure was a narrow, single-masted vessel, barely large enough for her, the captain, his wife, and a half-dozen crew. It seemed so small at first, but Captain Zobek was a calm and cautious man, an excellent sailor, and even if he was a pagan, he guided the ship with care along the coast, always finding a sheltered cove to ride out high storms. The captain oversaw the work as the men secured the mooring. Zobek was a short man, even-shouldered with Shallan, and he wore his long white tailing eyebrows up in a curious spiked pattern. It was like he was waving two fans over his eyes, a foot long each. He wore a simple knit cap and a silver-bottomed black coat. She'd imagined him getting that scar on his jaw in a furious sea battle with pirates. The day before, she'd been disappointed to hear it had been caused by a loose tackle during rough weather. His wife, Ashley, was already walking down the gangplank to register their vessel. The captain saw Shallan inspecting him, and so walked over. It was a business connection of her family, long trusted by her father. That was good, since the plan she and her brothers concocted contained no place for bringing along a lady-in-waiting or nurse. The plan made Shallan nervous. Very, very nervous. She hated being duplicitous. But the financial state of her house, they either needed a spectacular infusion of wealth or some other edge in local Vidan house politics. Otherwise, they wouldn't last a year. First things first, Shallan thought, forcing herself to become find just Hasna Colleen, assuming she wasn't moved off without you again. I sent a lad on your behalf, Brightness, Zobek said. If the princess is still here, we shall soon know. Shallan nodded gratefully, still clutching her drawing pad. Out in the city, there were people everywhere. Some wore familiar clothing, trousers and shirts that blazed up the front for the men, skirts and colorful blouses for the women. Those could have been from her homeland, Jack Heved, but Kharbrandt was a free city, a small politically fragile city-state. It held, thank for the likes greatly appreciated, it held little territory that docks open to all ships that passed, and asked no question about nationality or status. People flowed to it. Great many of the people she saw were exotic. The single sheet wraps around. Those single sheet wraps would mark a man or woman from Sashik, far to the west. The long coat enveloping down to the ankles but open in the front, like cloaks, where were those from? She'd rarely seen so many parchmen as she noted walking the docks. Carrying cargo on their backs, like the parchmen her father had owned. These were stout and thick of limbs, with their odd marbled skin, some parts pale or black, others a deep crimson. The mottled pattern was unique to each individual. After chasing Hasna Colleen from town to town for the better part of 6 months, Shallan was beginning to think she'd never catch the woman. Was the princess avoiding her? No, that didn't seem likely. Shallan just wasn't important enough to wait for. Brightness Hassan Colleen was one of the most powerful women in the world, and one of the most famous. She was the only member of a faithful royal house who was a professed heretic. Shallan tried not to grow anxious. Most likely they discovered that Hasna had moved on again. The Wind's Pleasure would dock for the night, and Shallan would negotiate a price with the captain, steeply discounted because of a family investment in Zoberg shipping business to take her to the next port. Already, they were months past the time when Zoberg had expected to get. Already, they were months past the time when Zoberg was expected to be rid of her. She'd never sensed resentment from him. His honor and loyalty kept him agreeing to her request. However, his patience wouldn't last forever, and neither would her money. She'd already used over half the spheres she'd brought with her. It wouldn't abandon her in an unfamiliar city, of course, but might regrettably insist on taking her back to Vedana. Captain Italo called, pushing up the gangplank. He wore only a vest and loose baggy trousers, and a darkly tanned skin of one who walked in the sun. "No matches, sir. The dock register says Shasna hasn't left yet." "Ha!" the captain said, turning to Shallan. "The hunt is over." "Bless the herald," Shallan said softly. The captain smiled, flamboyant, eyebrows looking like streaks of light from his eyes. "It won't be your beautiful face that brought us this favorable wind. The winds themselves were entranced by you, brightness Shallan, and led us here." Shallan blushed, considering a response that wasn't particularly proper. "Ah," the captain said, pointing at her. "I can see you have a reply. I see it in your eyes, young miss. Spit it out. Words aren't meant to be kept inside." "You see, they are free creatures, and if locked away, they'll unsettle the stomach." "It's not polite," Shallan protested. Months of travel, and still you claim that. I keep telling you that we're sailors. Forgot how to be polite the moment we set foot on a ship. We are far beyond redemption now. She smiled. She's been trained by stern nurses and tutors to hold her tongue. Unfortunately, our brothers had been more determined in encouraging her to do the opposite. She made a habit of entertaining them with witty comments when nobody was near. She thought fondly of hours spent by the crackling great room hearth. The younger three of her four brothers huddled around her, listening as she made sport of their father's newest sycophant, or a travelling ardent. She'd often fabricated silly versions of conversations to fill the mouths of people who, She'd often fabricated silly versions of conversations to fill the mouth of people they could see, but not hear. That had established in her what her notice had referred to as an insolent streak, and the sailors were even more appreciative of a witty comment than her brothers had been. "Well," Shallan said to the captain, blushing but still eager to speak, "I was just thinking this. You said that my beauty coaxed the winds to deliver us to Cabrant with haste. Won't that imply that on other trips my lack of beauty was to blame for us arriving late?" "Well, come on, that's not a basic one thing to say. Oh, are you saying that I'm not beautiful on other days?" It's like a meme. You tell your girlfriend you're real beautiful today. She says, "Are you saying I'm not beautiful on other days?" So in reality, Shallan said, "You're telling me I'm beautiful precisely 1/6 of the time." "Nonsense, young miss. You're like a morning sunrise, you are. Like a sunrise. By that you mean entirely too crimson." She pulled out her long red hair, and prompt making men grouchy when they see me. He laughed. Several of the sailors nearby joined in. Alright then, Captain Sobek said. You're like a flower. She grimaced. I'm allergic to flowers. He raised an eyebrow. No, really, she admitted. I think they're quite captivating, but if you were to give me a bouquet, you'd soon find me in a fit so energetic that it would have you searching the walls for stray freckles that are blown free with the force of my sneezes. Well, be that true, I still say you're as pretty as a flower. If I am, then young men my age will be afflicted with the same allergy, but they keep their distance from me noticeably. She winced. Now see, I told you someone was polite. Young women should not act in such an irritable way. Ah, young miss, the captain said, tipping his neat cap toward her. The lad and I will miss your clever tongue. I'm not sure what we'll do without you. Stay likely, she said, and eat and sing and watch the waves. All the things you do now, only you shall have rather more time to accomplish all of it, as you won't be stumbling across a youthful girl as she sits on your deck, sketching and mumbling to herself. But you have my thanks, Captain, for a trip that was wonderful, if somewhat exaggerated in it. It tipped his cap to her in acknowledgement. Sheldon grinned. She hadn't expected being out on her own to be so liberating. Her brothers had worried that she'd be frightened. They saw her as timid because she didn't like to argue and remained quiet when large groups were talking. And perhaps she was timid. Keeping away from Jack Yvette was daunting, but it was also wonderful. She'd filled 3 sketchbooks with pictures of the creatures and people she'd seen, and while I worry of her house finances was a perpetual cloud, it was balanced by the sheer delight of experience. Subek, thank you for the likes, much appreciated, guys. Subek had begun making dock arrangements for his ship. He was a good man. And as for his praise of her supposedly beauty, she took what that was for what it was, a kind, if overstated mark of affection. She was pale-skinned, in an era when a letty tan were seen as a mark of true beauty, and though she had light blue eyes, her impure family line was manifest in her auburn red hair, not a single lock of proper black. Her freckles had faded. As she reached young womanhood, her ought to be blessed, but there was still some visible, dust on her cheeks and nose. Young miss, the captain said to her, after conferring with his men, your brightness, Hasna, should undoubtedly be at the conclave, you see. Oh, where the Palladium is. Ah, yes, and the king lives there too. It's the center of the city, so to speak, except it's on the top. He scratched his head. Well, anyway, Brightness Hasina Colleen, the sister to the king, and she will stay nowhere else, not in Cabrant. Yab here will show you the way. You can deliver your trunk later. Many thanks, Captain, she said. The wind has brought us safely. A phrase of thanks in the Italian language. The captain smiled broadly. She had no idea. Italian was quite good when she was reading, but hearing it spoken. Was something entirely. She smiled at him, which seemed the proper response, for he laughed, gesturing to one of the sailors. We'll wait here in this dock for 2 days, he told her. There's a high storm coming, you see, so we cannot leave. If the situation with the Brightness Hasna does not proceed as hoped, we'll take you back to Jack Eved. Thank you again. For people who just joined the stream, I'm reading The Way of the Kings in the Stormlight series. Thank you again. There's nothing, young Mrs. said. Nothing but what we've been doing anyway. We can take on goods here and all. Besides, that's right. Besides that right nice likeness of my wife you gave me for my cabin. Right nice. She stood over to Yalb, giving him instructions. Shallan waited, putting her drawing back into her leather portfolio. Yalb, the name was difficult for her Veddan tongue to pronounce. Why were the Italians so fond of mashing letters together, without proper vowels? Yalb waved for her. She moved to follow. Be careful yourself, lass, the captain warned. As she passed, even a safety like Cabrant hides dangers. Keep your wits about you. I should think I prefer my wits into my skulls, Captain, she replied, carefully stepping onto the gangplank. If I keep them about me, instead, then someone has gotten tired loose. Whew, I've been reading for like an hour. My tongue is getting like tongue-tied when I keep going. But I don't want to stop because I want to finish an entire chapter and like close it instead of like stopping halfway through. How long to the next chapter? Let me just quickly check that. That is a lot. Anyways. Alrighty then, let's get back into it. The captain laughed, waving her farewell, as she made her way down the gangplank, holding the railings with her free hand. Like all Vorian women, she kept her left hand as safe and covered. This wasn't only a free hand. Common dark-eyed women would wear a glove, but a woman of her rank was expected to show more modesty than that. In her case, she kept her safe hand covered by the oversized cuffs of her left sleeves, which was buttoned close. That does sound uncomfortable. The dress was a traditional Vorian cut, form-fitting through the bust, shoulders, and waist, the flowing skirt below. It was blue silk, with shawl buttons up the side. She carried a satchel by pressing it to her chest with her safe hand, while holding the railing with her free hand. She stepped off the gangplank into the furious activity of the docks, passengers running this way and that, men in red coats tracking cargoes on ledges. Cabran was a Vorian kingdom, like Aletka, and like Shallan's own Jack Keved. They weren't pagans here, and writing was a feminine art. What? Men learned only glyphs, leaving letters and reading to their wives and sisters. That sounds so stupid. What? Who made this up? She hadn't asked, but she was certain Captain Zovek could read. She had seen him holding books. It made her uncomfortable. Reading was an unseemly trait in a man. This sounds fucking stupid. Who made this up? At least men who weren't ardent. You wanna ride? Yalb said. Asked her in his rural Thalian dialect, so thick she could barely make out the words. Yes, please. He nodded and rushed off, leaving her on the docks, surrounded by a group of Pashmen who were laboriously moving wooden crates from one pier to another. Pashmen were thick-witted, but they made excellent walkers. She just called them stupid. Never complaining, always doing as they were told. I thought I preferred them to regular slaves. Makes sense. Were they Alethi? Were the Alethi really fighting Pashmen out in the shattered plain? That seemed so odd to Shallan. Pashmen didn't fight. They were docile and practical. Mute, of course. From what she'd heard, the ones out on the shattered plains, the Pashendi, they were called, were physically different from regular Pashmen, stronger, taller, keener of mind. Perhaps they weren't really Pashmen at all, but distant relatives of some kind. To her surprise, she could see signs of animal life all around the docks. A few sky eels undulated through the air, searching for rats or fish. Tiny crabs hidden between cracks in the dock's boards. And a cluster of haspers clung to the dock thick logs. In the streets inland of the docks, growling mink scowled in the shadows, watching for more that would have dropped. She couldn't resist pulling open her portfolio and beginning a sketch of pouncing sky eel. Wasn't she afraid of all the people? She held her sketch pad with her safe hand, hidden fingers wrapping around the top, as she used charcoal pencil to draw. Before she was finished, our guide returned with a man pulling a curious contraption with two large wheels and a canopy-covered seat. She hesitantly lowered her sketchpad. She'd expected a palanquin. The man pulling the machine was short and dark-skinned, with a wide smile and full lips. He gestured for Shallan to sit, and she did so with modest grace. Her nurses had driven to her. The driver asked her a question in clear-sounding language she didn't recognize. What was that, she asked. He wants to know if you'd like to be pulled the long way or the short way. I'm not quite sure what the difference is. I suspect one takes longer, Shallan said. Or you're a clever one, Yab said, something to the porter in that same clipped language, and the man responded. The long way gives a good view of the city, Yab said. The short way goes straight up to the conclave. Not many good views, he says. I guess he noticed you were new to the city. Do I stand out that much? No, of course not, Brightness. And by that you mean that I'm obvious as a wart on a queen's nose. That's very descriptive. Yab laughed. Afraid so. But you can't go someplace a second time until you've been there first time, I reckon. Everyone has to stand out sometimes. You might as well do it in a pretty way like yourself. She'd had to get used to gentle flirtation from the sailors. They were never too forward, and she suspected the captain's wife had spoken to them sternly, when she noticed how it made Shallan blush. Back at her father's manor, servants, even those who had been full citizens and afraid to step out of their places. The porter was still waiting for an answer. The short way, please, she told Yab, though she longed to take the scenic path. She was finally in a real city, and she took the direct route. But Brightness Hasna had proven to be elusive as a wild gosling. Best to be quick. The main roadway cut up the hillside in switchbacks, so even a short way gave her time to see much of the city. It proved intoxicantly rich with strange people, sight and ringing bells. Shallan sat back and took it all in. Buildings were grouped by color, and that color seemed to indicate purpose. Shops selling the same items we painted the same shades, violet for clothing, green for food. Homes had their own pattern. Though Shallan couldn't interpret it, the colors were soft, with washed-out subdued tonalities. Yab walked alongside the cart, and the porters began to walk back toward her. Yab translated He says that the city is special because of the lake here. Many cities were built in lakes, areas protected from high storm by nearby rocks formation. Khabran is one of the most sheltered major cities in the world. Yap continued, and the bells are a symbol of that. It said that they were first erected to warn the high storm was blowing, since the winds were so soft that people didn't always notice. Yap hesitated. He's just saying things because he wants to beat the brightness. I've heard that story. I think it's a blustering ridiculous. If the wind blew strong enough to move bells, then people would notice. Besides, people didn't notice it was raining on their blustering heads. Sheldon smiled. It's alright. You can continue. The reporter chatted on in his clipped voice. What language was that, anyway? Sheldon listened to Yap's translation, drinking in the sights, sounds, and unfortunately scents. She grew up accustomed to the crisp smell of freshly dusted furniture. Welcome to people who just joined. Reading Way of the Kings by Brandon Anderson? I've forgotten his name. Way of the Kings in the Stormlight series. There was nothing clean in what she smelled here. Each passing alleyway had its own unique array of revolting stenches. This alternated with the spicy scent of street vendors and their foods, and the juxtaposition was even more nauseating. Fortunately, Apata moved into the central part of the roadway. The stenches abated, though it did slow them as they had to contend with thicker traffic. She gogged at those they passed, those men with gloved hands and faintly bluish skin from Natantan. But who were these tall, stately people dressed in robes of black? And the men with their beards bound in cords, making them rod-like. The sounds put Sheldon in the mind of competing choruses of wild songlings near home, only multiplied in variety and volume. 100 voices called to one another, mingling with doors and slamming, wheels rolling on the stone. Occasionally, Scar eels crying. Ever-present bells tinkled in the background, louder when the wind blew. They were displayed in the windows of shops, hung from rafters. Each lantern pole along the streets had a bell hung on the lamp. The cart had a small silvery one at the very tip of the canopy. When she was halfway up the hillside, a rolling wave of loud clock bells rang the hour. The varied, unsynchronized chimes made a clangorous din. The crowd thinned as they reached the upper quarter of the city, and eventually, our porter pulled her to a massive building at the very apex of the city, painted white. It was carved from the rock face itself, rather than built of bricks or clay. The pillar out front grew seamlessly from the stones, and the back side of the building melded smoothly into the cliff. The outcropping of roof had a squat dome atop them. And were painted in metallic colors. Light-eyed women passed in and out carrying scribing utensils and wearing dresses like Shallants, their left hands properly curved. The men entering or leaving the buildings with military-style rowing coats and stiff trousers, button-ups the sides and ending in a stiff collar that wrapped the entire neck. Many carried swords at their waist, the belt wrapping around the knee-length coats. The porter stopped and made a comment to Yal. Sailor began arguing with him, hands on hips. Sheldon smiled at his stern expressions, and she blinked pointedly, affixing the scene in her memory for later sketching. He's offering to split the difference with me if I let him inflate the price of the tip. Trick. Yab said, shaking his head and offering a hand to help Sheldon from the cart. She stepped down, looking at the porter, who shrugged. smelled like a child who had been caught sneaking sweets. She clutched the satchel with her curved hand, searching through it with her forehand. She clutched the satchel with her curved arm, searching through it with her free hand for her money pouch. How much should I actually give him? Two clear sheep. What is getting dry? Two clear chips should be more than enough. That it offered one, the thief wanted to ask for 5. Before this trip, she never used money. How do you not use money? What? She just admired the face. How do you know how much of a daddy's girl are you? She just admired the fears for their beauty. That is not an efficient way to store money. Fears are... Look, it's not very efficient in space usage. Each one was composed of a glass bead, so a little larger than a person's thumbnail, with much smaller gemstones at the center. So inefficient. The gemstones could absorb stormlight, and that made the spheres glow. A cylinder would be better. When she opened the money pouch, shells of ruby, emerald, diamond, and sapphire shone out on her face. She fished out 3 diamond chips with the smallest denomination. Emeralds were the most valuable, but they could be used by soul casters to create food. The glass part of most spheres was the same size. The size of the gemstone at the center determining the denomination. 3 chips, for instance, each had only a tiny splinter of diamond inside. Even that was enough to glow with stormlight. Far fainter than a lamp, but still visible. A mark, the medium denomination for a sphere, was a little less bright than a candle, and it took 5 chips to make a mark. She'd only brought in few spheres, and she'd heard that the done ones were considered suspect, and sometimes a money lender would have to be brought in to judge the authenticity of the gemstones. She kept the most valuable spheres she had in a safe pouch. Of course, which was buttoned to the inside of her left sleeve. She handed the 3 chips to Yalab, who cocked his head. She nodded at the porter, blushing, realizing that she'd reflexively used Yalab like a master servant intermediary. Would he be offended? He laughed and stood up stiffly, as if imitating a master servant, paying the porter with a mock stern expression. The porter laughed, bowed to Shalon, then pulled the cart away. "This is for you," Shalon said, taking out a ruby mark and handing it to Yalb. "The brightness is too much. It's partially out of 10, she said, but it's also to pay you to stay here and wait for a few hours, in case I return." Wait a few hours for a fire mark. That's wages for a week's sailing, and it should be enough to make certain you don't wander off. "I'll be right here," Yalb said, giving her an elaborate bow that was surprisingly well executed. Shalon took a deep breath and strode up steps toward the conclave's imposing entrance. The carved rocks looked remarkable. The carved rocks really was remarkable. The artist wanted to linger and study it, but she didn't dare. Entering the large building was like being swallowed. The hallway inside was lined with stormlight lamps that shone with white light. Diamond brooms were probably set inside them. Most buildings of fine construction use stormlight to provide illumination. A brom, the highest denomination of sphere, glowed with about the same light as several candles. Their light shone evenly and softly on the many attendants, scribes, and light eyes. Even through the hallway, the buildings appeared to be constructed as one broad, high, and long tunnel, burrowed into the rock. Grand chambers lined the sides, and subsidiary corridors branched off to the central grand promenade. Thank you for the likes, and for people who just joined, I'm reading The Way of Kings in the Starlight series. We're almost done with chapter 3. She raised her free hand in a sign of need, and sure enough, a master servant in a crisp white shirt and black trousers hurried over to her. Brightness, he asked, speaking a native Vedan, likely because of the color of her hair. I seek Hasna Colleen, Shallan said. I have word that she is within these walls. The master servants bowed crisply. Most master servants prided themselves on their refined service. The very same air that Yab had been mocking moments ago. I shall return, Brightness. It would be of the second Nan, a dark-eyed citizen of very high rank. Foreign belief, one's calling, the task to which one dedicated one's life, was of vital importance. Choosing a good profession and working hard at it was the best way to ensure good placement in the afterlife. It's just Indians? Sound like karma. Sound like an Indian caste system. The specific devotee that one visited for worshipping often had to be the nature of one's chosen calling. Yeah, sounds like Indians. Shallan folded her hands, waiting. She had thought long about her own calling. Yava's choice was her art. She did so love sketching. It was more than just the drawing that triggered her. It was a study. The question raised by observation. Why weren't the sky eels afraid of people? What did the Haspers feed on? Why did a rat population thrive in one area but fail in another? So she's chosen natural history instead. She longed to be a true scholar, to receive real instructions, to spend time on deep research and study. Was that part of why she suggested this daring plan? Seeking out Hasna and becoming a ward? Perhaps. However, she needed to remain focused. Becoming Hasna ward, and therefore student, was only one step. She considered this as she idly walked up to a pillar, using her free hand to feel the polished stone. Thanking for the like, much appreciated. Like much of Russia, save for certain coastal regions, Cabrants was built in a raw, unbroken stone. The building outside set directly on the rock, and this one sliced into it. The pillar was granite, she guessed, though her geological knowledge was sketchy. The floor was covered with long, burnt orange rugs. The material was dense, designed to look rich but bear heavy traffic. The broad rectangular hallway had an odd feel to it. One book she'd read claimed that Cabrant had been founded way back into the Shadow Days, years before the last desolation. That would make it old indeed. Thousands of years old, created before the terrors of hierarchy, long before even the Krets, back when Voidbringers, bodies of stone, were said to have stalked the land. Brightness, a voice said. Shallan turned to find the servant had returned. This way, Brightness. She led to the servant and led her quickly down the busy hallway. She went over how to present herself to Hasna. The woman was a legend. Even Shallan, even the remote estates of Jacques-Yved, had heard of the Atlantis king's brilliant heretic sister. Hasna was only 34 years old. If many felt she could have obtained the cap of a master scholar, it went for a vocal denunciation of religion. Most, specifically, she denounced the devotees, the various religions, congregations, and proper foreign people joined. Improper quips would not serve Shallan well here. She would have to be proper, Worship to a woman of great renown was the best way to be schooled? In the feminine arts, music, painting, writing, logic, and science. What? I can't. So, it's much like how a young man would train in the honor guard of a bright lord respected. Charlene, this is so stupid. Charlene had originally written to Hasna requesting a worship in desperation. She hadn't actually expected the woman to reply in affirmative. When she had Violetta commanding Charlene to attend her in Madrid in 2 weeks, Charlene had been shocked. She'd been chasing the woman ever since. Hasna was a heretic. Would she demand that Charlene renounce her faith? She doubted she could do such a thing. Boring's teaching regarding one's glory and calling, one of a few refugees during the difficult days, and her father had met his worst. She turned into a narrow hallway, entering corridors increasingly far from the main cabin. Finally, the master servant stopped at the corner and gestured for Charlene to continue. There were voices coming from the corridor to the right. Charlene hesitated. Sometimes she wondered how it would have come to this. She was the quiet one, the timid one, the youngest of 5 siblings, and the only girl, sheltered, protected all her life, and now the hopes of her entire house rested on her shoulder. Their father was dead. It was vital that that remained a secret. She didn't like to think of that day. She all but blocked that from her mind. And trained herself to think of other things, but the effect of his loss could not be ignored. He had made many promises, some business deals, some bribes, some of the latter disguised as former. Al-Davar owed great amount of money to a great number of people. Wanted her father to keep them all appeased. The creditors would soon begin making demands. There was nobody to turn to. Her family, mostly because of her father, was loathed even by its allies. I, Prince Valm, the bright light to my family, Geifelti was ailing, and no longer offered them the protection he once had. When it became known that her father was dead, and her family bankrupt, that would be the end of House Davar. They'd be consumed and subjugated to another house. They'd be walked with the bones as punishment, and in fact, they might even face assassination. By disgruntled creditors. Preventing that depended on Charlene, and the first step came with Hasna Colleen. Charlene took a deep breath, then strolled around the corner. Goddamn. That is the end of chapter 3. Thank you for listening. For those people, I'm not even sure anyone stayed at the end. But for the people still here, thank you for listening. Like and subscribe to my Reddit channel if you want to get a notification for me going live, I think. Is that even a thing? Anyways, I'm going to be reading tomorrow, chapter 4. I've been going for an hour and 30 minutes. Whew. No one ever tells you that reading is tiring, but it is. I mean, reading stuff is not tiring, but reading out loud is tiring. You stumble, you miss your words. It's a slugfest. Anyway, thank you for listening. Iron Man.